January 1945. The winter didn't just come to Budapest, it moved in, settling into the bones of the shattered city. The air wasn't cold, it was a solid, biting thing, thick with the smell of powdered brick, cordite, and something far worse, something sweet and cloying that came from under the snowdrifts. The Danube, choked with ice and wreckage, was a gray scar through the heart of a corpse. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a tombstone. The grand buildings on Castle Hill were hollow-eyed skulls, their facades pockmarked by artillery. The streets, once vibrant arteries, were now frozen veins clogged with the debris of war, a burnt-out tram, an orphaned piano, the blackened skeleton of a tiger from the zoo, its glassy eyes reflecting nothing. From their forward observation post, in a looted bleakery on the Pest outskirts, 2 Soviet scouts watched the city through a shell hole in the wall, not with the eagerness of conquerors, but with the weary dread of men about to enter a labyrinth of stone and death. They saw no clear front line, only a shattered silent chessboard where shadows moved. A Hungarian woman, her face a mask of frost and exhaustion, dragged a sledge with a bundled body towards a makeshift pyre. A German patrol, gray ghosts in greatcoats, scurried across a square, heads low, not from discipline, but from a primal, animal fear of the snipers they knew were everywhere, in every ruin. The scouts listened to the silence. It was the worst part. The sporadic crump of a distant shell, the angry buzz of a lone machine gun, these were just punctuation in a long, terrible sentence of stillness. Rumor was the only currency left. The Germans whispered of a relief force that would never come. The Soviets passed on stories of fanatical SS men booby-trapping every basement. In this frozen limbo, truth had died weeks ago. The city was dead, but the war inside it was still twitching, a reflex in a corpse. And into this graveyard of certainty, they were about to send a single steel heartbeat. The command post was in the cellar of a shelled-out villa, the map table lit by a single guttering kerosene lamp that threw monstrous shadows on the damp walls. Lieutenant Alexei Volkov, at 26 an old man in this war, stood before his battalion commander, Major Semyonov, whose face was etched with a fatigue no sleep could cure. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, earth, and cheap tobacco. The order wasn't written down. It was spoken quietly, almost conversationally, which made it all the more chilling. "Your 34 is the fastest, the most experienced crew," Semyonov said, his finger tracing a line on the map deep into the urban maze. "The infantry is pinned down. Artillery is blind. You will go in alone, before first light. Make noise. Look like the tip of the spear. If they panic and fall back, we will know they are brittle. If they hit you with everything, we will know that too." The unspoken words hung in the frozen air, and you will be dead, but we will have our answer. Back at the tank park, hidden under a camouflage net crusted with ice, Volkov gathered his crew. The driver, Baba Yaga, a Siberian with eyes like chips of flint, wiped his hands on an oily rag, already mentally checking the transmission. The gunner, Kostya, a young prodigy from the Urals who could hit a moving aperture at 1,000 meters, polished a shell in silent concentration. The loader, Mishka, a bear of a man from Kuban, hummed a quiet folk tune, as he always did before action. "We are the bait and the hook," Volkov said simply, laying out the lunatic plan. "We go in loud and proud, not like scouts, like we own the damn city and an army is behind us." Baba Yaga grunted. "A single wolf howling in the forest makes the herd think the pack has arrived." A grim, understanding smile passed between them. They were to become a phantom, a steel ghost whose echo would be mistaken for an avalanche. As they climbed into the freezing belly of their T-34, the pre-dawn darkness felt absolute. The hatch clanged shut, sealing them in their own world of oil, cold metal, and shared breath. The engine roared to life, a defiant challenge to the silent, waiting city. Their mission was not to fight a battle, but to stage a performance where a single actor had to convince an entire army that the curtain had already fallen. Failure meant an anonymous fiery death in a nameless street. Success was a mirage they had to make real. With a lone, grinding roar that shattered the fragile morning silence, the T-34 emerged from the skeleton of an outer suburb and onto a broad, corpse-like boulevard. Inside, the world was reduced to a symphony of steel, the shriek of the gearbox as Baba Yaga deliberately kept the speed low and menacing, the clang of a fresh shell rammed home by Mishka, the tense breathing in the intercom. Through his commander's prism, Volkov saw a canyon of ruin. Frost-glazed tram wires hung like macabre garlands over the road, strewn with the detritus of a collapsing world. He ordered Kostya to traverse the turret smoothly, left to right and back, the long 85mm gun pointing at empty windows and dark alley mouths, a silent, scanning predator. They moved not with the hurried dash of a scout, but with the ponderous, arrogant inevitability of the first wave. The thunder of their tracks echoed off the facades of bombed-out palaces, multiplying, becoming the sound of an advancing column. A lone figure, a Hungarian soldier or a deserter, froze in a doorway, his eyes wide with terror, before vanishing into the shadows. The illusion was working. They were no longer just a tank, they were an avatar of the inevitable, a steel shadow cast by a force that the enemy was now desperately imagining behind them. High in a bell tower, a German artillery observer, his face raw from the cold, pressed the headphones to his ears. He'd lost contact with his battery an hour ago. Through his scissorscope, he saw it. A single Soviet tank, dark green against the white snow, rolling down the main axis as if on parade. But his mind, trained for war and wired by days of siege-fueled panic, refused the simple truth. One tank? Impossible. A suicide mission? No. He watched the turret rotate with chilling discipline. This was not a lost unit. This was point reconnaissance. The vanguard. The main force must be maneuvering behind the ruins, using this vehicle as a can opener. His hand shook as he scribbled a note for a runner. Schwerer Panzerspauwagen auf dem Beichizlinski Ut. Vorhut einer größeren Angriffsformation. Vermutlich Umfassung im Norden. For the observer, the specific roar of the lone T-34's engine merged in his mind with the ghostly rumble of the whole Second Ukrainian Front. The tank, unaware of the specific alarm it had just triggered, turned onto a narrower side street, its track shedding chunks of frozen mud onto the cobblestones, the only physical proof of its passing, soon to be buried by the falling snow. Fear, in the frozen labyrinth of Budapest, became a virus transmitted by distorted radio waves and the whispers of running men. In a cramped basement command post, a German major, his uniform stained with brick dust, stared at conflicting reports. First, a frantic call from an outpost on Bochy Street about a tank column. Then a garbled transmission from the northern sector mentioning engine noises and moving shadows. His map was a chaos of question marks. The logical part of his mind screamed that a major attack would be preceded by a hellish artillery barrage, but the silence from the Soviet guns was even more terrifying. It suggested a surgical, confident strike. A young lieutenant burst in, breathless, reporting Panzerfausts teams pulling back from a key intersection without orders, swearing they'd seen the silhouettes of at least 3 T-34s flanking through parallel streets. The major's own fear completed the picture his eyes couldn't see. This wasn't a probe. It was the beginning of the final cleaving of the pocket. He grabbed the field telephone, his order not a tactical retreat, but a desperate act of self-preservation. Fall back to secondary line at Elizabeth Bridge. They are breaking through in the north. The message echoed down the line, each retelling adding more tanks, more infantry, more inevitability. Inside the iron belly of the real T-34, the universe was reduced to the view from slits and periscopes.
Volkov saw only empty windows and snow-drifted barricades. Kostya's finger rested lightly on the trigger, aching for a target that never appeared. They were tensed for the storm of steel, for the telltale flash of a Panzerfaust from a cellar window, but the storm never came. Instead, they witnessed strange, silent signs. A machine gun nest, seemingly intact, was abandoned, a steaming mug of ersatz coffee left beside it. Down a long avenue, they saw the distant backs of a gray-coated squad hastily dragging a wounded comrade around a corner, disappearing without a single shot fired. Mishka, peering through the loader's hatch, grunted in disbelief. "Comrade Lieutenant, are they running from us?" The realization dawned on Volkov slowly, then with the force of a revelation. The distant crumps of explosions they heard weren't aimed at them. It was the enemy destroying their own stockpiles in a panic. They were no longer just a tank. They had become an idea, a catalyst for a collapse that was now feeding on itself. The most powerful weapon in this sector wasn't their 85mm gun, but the paralyzing, contagious dread that echoed in the empty streets ahead of them. They advanced not into enemy fire, but into a vacuum created by pure, unadulterated terror.
The illusion of invincibility was shattered on the corner of a narrow, canyon-like street in the old Jewish quarter. The fear they had sown had cleared most paths, but not all. Here, a lone, veteran crew of a Hungarian anti-tank unit, abandoned by their retreating comrades, had held their ground out of sheer stubbornness or fatalism. Their camouflaged German 75mm Pak-40, tucked into a collapsed shopfront, was the trap that the chaos of retreat had left unsprung. As the T-34's hull emerged into the killing zone, its side exposed, the Hungarian gunner, a man who had fought from the Don to the Tisa, squeezed the trigger. The scream of the shell was the sound of reality reclaiming its due. It was a nervous shot, fired a fraction of a second too early, and it struck not the vulnerable side armor, but the forward drive wheel with a cataclysmic clang that echoed through the tank like a giant's hammer blow. The vehicle lurched violently, steel teeth shearing off in a shower of sparks. Inside, the crew was thrown into a deafening cacophony of ringing metal and shouts. The illusion of invincibility was shattered on the corner of a narrow, canyon-like street in the old Jewish quarter. The fear they had sown had cleared most paths, but not all. Here, a lone, veteran crew of a Hungarian anti-tank unit, abandoned by their retreating comrades, had held their ground out of sheer stubbornness or fatalism. Their camouflaged German 75mm Pak-40, tucked into a collapsed shopfront, was the trap that the chaos of retreat had left unsprung. As the T-34's hull emerged into the killing zone, its side exposed, the Hungarian gunner, a man who had fought from the Don to the Tisa, squeezed the trigger. The scream of the shell was the sound of reality reclaiming its due. It was a nervous shot, fired a fraction of a second too early, and it struck not the vulnerable side armor, but the forward drive wheel with a cataclysmic clang that echoed through the tank like a giant's hammer blow. The vehicle lurched violently, steel teeth shearing off in a shower of sparks. Inside, the crew was thrown into a deafening cacophony of ringing metal and shouts. "The tracks hit! Hard left, Yaga! Now!" Volkov roared, his voice cutting through the din. Baba Yaga, reacting on pure instinct, wrenched the left lever, the damaged wheel shrieking in protest as the tank pivoted drunkenly, presenting its frontal armor to the gun. In that frozen, eternal second, two master gunners dueled across 50 meters of shattered cobblestone. The Hungarian loader fumbled with a new shell, his fingers numb with cold and panic, losing precious seconds. Inside the T-34, the world had narrowed to Kostya's periscope. He hadn't needed the command. The moment of impact had painted the enemy's position in his mind, a flash of flame, a puff of powdered brick. His hands moved with a calm that belied the adrenaline, the turret traverse whining as he aligned the crosshairs. He didn't aim at the gun shield, he aimed at the dark cavity behind it. "Armor piercing, ready," Mishka bellowed, slamming the round home. "Fire!"
The 85mm barked, the concussion wave rattling the ruins. The shell traveled its short, violent path and struck true, detonating the ready ammunition stacked beside the pack. The shop front vanished in a boiling cloud of smoke, flame, and lethal fragments. No one emerged. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire, broken only by the labored idle of their wounded tank and the metallic ping of cooling metal. No cheers, no relief, only the quick, sharp breaths of men who had just stared into the abyss. "The track's holding, but it's damaged. We can't take another hit like that," Baba Yaga reported grimly. They were no longer a ghost. They were a wounded animal, leaving a trail of crippled steel and fresh, undeniable evidence of their lonely presence. The illusion was over. Now it was raw survival. The single brutal duel had exposed their vulnerability, but the shockwave of fear it generated had already traveled far ahead of them, reaching critical mass in the enemy's fragile command chain. The distant thunder of the exploding Pak-40 ammunition was misinterpreted by listening posts as the sound of sustained Soviet artillery suppressing the last pockets of resistance. This misperception was the final straw. From their isolated strongpoints, German and Hungarian units, already rattled by hours of confusing reports about a breakthrough, now heard what they believed was the main attack beginning. The order, long debated and feared, was given: a general contraction towards Castle Hill and Buda, a retreat across the Danube to avoid total annihilation. But a retreat in such chaos was not a military maneuver, it was a collapse. Squads became separated from their officers, vital communication lines were cut, and the planned, disciplined demolitions turned into panicked, scorched earth chaos. Inside the wounded T-34, the crew witnessed the city convulsing around them. The sporadic sounds of small arms fire were now drowned out by deeper, more systematic booms that made the ground tremble. A block ahead, the elegant facade of the National Museum shuddered as a massive internal detonation blew out its windows in a cloud of smoke and dust. A pre-planted charge detonated too early or out of sheer spite. They passed intersections littered with discarded helmets, empty ammunition crates, and even a field kitchen, its coals still glowing. The path of their advance was no longer just cleared by fear, it was being cleared by a self-destructive retreat. Kostya, his eyes still pressed to the site, whispered, "They're blowing up their own city to keep it from us." Volkov felt no triumph, only a cold, grim understanding. Their audacious bluff had worked too well. They had not just probed the enemy's defenses, they had inadvertently tripped a psychological wire, triggering a chain reaction of defeatism that was now physically dismantling the city. They were driving through the epicenter of a self-inflicted disaster. But the new, terrifying danger was no longer just enemy guns, it was the collapsing architecture and the unknown map of German demolitions around them. Every approaching cross street was a potential death trap, not from a Panzerfaust, but from 1,000 tons of masonry falling from a rigged building. This stone trap was not just crumbling, it was actively trying to bury them alive. The return journey was a nerve-shredding ordeal of a different kind. The confidence of their advance was gone, replaced by a hyper-vigilant dread. Every muffled explosion in the distance made them flinch, expecting a collapse. The damaged track, its tortured shriek now a defining characteristic of their tank, was a dead giveaway, announcing their presence and vulnerability to any remaining enemy. Baba Yaga, his arms aching from fighting the sluggish controls, navigated not by the optimal route, but by the paths of least ruin, avoiding unstable-looking piles of rubble and wide avenues where they could be targeted from afar. Kostya never left his sight, his eyes burning from strain, scanning every upper window and rooftop. The city they now moved through was a ghost town in the literal sense, emptied of organized resistance, but filled with the echoes of its own destruction. They passed the smoldering wrecks of German trucks, abandoned not in panic now, but as part of a grim, systematic withdrawal. The silence was punctuated only by the distant, methodical booms of continued demolitions on the Danube bridges, the sound of the enemy severing its own limbs to escape. The crew spoke little, each man locked in his own cocoon of exhaustion and lingering adrenaline, the metallic taste of fear still sharp in their mouths. Emerging from the urban canyons into the more open, shell-pocked outskirts felt like surfacing from a drowning nightmare. The gray light of the winter afternoon was blinding. Their own forward positions, marked by a cautious infantryman's wave from a foxhole, seemed alien. As the T-34 limped into the battalion's area, its battered state, the shattered drive wheel, the fresh scorch marks from near misses they hadn't even registered, told a more eloquent story than any report. The hatch opened, and the cold air hit them like a physical blow, sharp and clean, free of the smell of burning and death. Major Semyonov approached, his eyes flickering from their faces, etched with deep fatigue, to the wounded beast of a tank. Volkov's salute was automatic, his report delivered in a hoarse, flat monotone, coordinates of abandoned strongpoints, evidence of retreat, the main axes of demolition. There was no celebration, no backslapping, only a slow, dawning understanding in the major's eyes as the radio operator ran up with a decoded intercept. Enemy units were reporting being under heavy pressure and were consolidating a new, shrunken perimeter. The phantom advance had been logged as real. The crew slid to the frozen ground, their legs weak. They had not won a battle, they had weaponized a hallucination. Their victory was measured in the silent, empty streets they had left behind, a vacuum soon to be filled not with thunder, but with the cautious, disbelieving footsteps of their own infantry. The labyrinth had released them, but its shadow would linger in their bones for a long time.
There was no ceremony. The crippled T-34 was dragged to the rear by a lumbering recovery vehicle, its war likely over. For Volkov and his crew, the aftermath was a blur of mundane yet profound rituals, a desperate gulp of hot kasha from the field kitchen that tasted like ambrosia, a deep, dreamless sleep in a freezing dugout, and the slow, meticulous cleaning of their personal weapons. No generals came to congratulate them, no war correspondents sought their story. Their debriefing with Major Semyonov lasted 15 minutes. The intelligence was fed into the machine of war, becoming a single line in the next day's operational order. Enemy resistance in Sector 7B has significantly weakened. Exploit success with forward battalions. By the following dawn, they were reassigned to a fresh T-34 from a replacement pool, its paint unscratched, its engines smelling of the factory. They were just another crew again. The only tangible evidence of their journey into the city's heart was the lingering 1,000-yard stare they shared, and the way Baba Yaga would unconsciously listen to the sound of their new tank's tracks, checking for that fatal grinding scream. After 2 days of rest, and with their tank deemed beyond quick repair, they were reassigned to a fresh T-34 from a replacement pool. The real victory parade took place without fanfare and hours after their return. Cautious Soviet riflemen, expecting a bitter fight for every crossing, advanced through the sectors the tank had haunted. They found abandoned weapons, smoldering fires, and a silence that was deafening. The enemy had receded like a fever breaking. The battle for Budapest would rage for weeks more, bloody and brutal. But in this pocket, the back of the defense had been broken by a phantom. Years later, in the crisp pages of official histories, the event would be reduced to a strategic conclusion. As a result of aggressive reconnaissance and mounting pressure, enemy units were forced to contract their perimeter. No one would write about the sweat on Kostya's brow as he lined up the killing shot, or the weight of the illusion they had to carry. Their triumph was of the most private and profound kind. They had walked into the valley of the shadow, wielded fear as a weapon, and returned to see the direct, tangible consequence of their actions. Lives saved on their side, and an enemy's will shattered, not by 1,000 shells, but by a single, perfect, echoing idea. It was a victory that would never have a monument, but for the men who knew, it was the purest form of war, the mind's triumph over matter.